Hello, everyone. Welcome to this third episode of MoLab Conversations on COVID, mobility, and well-being. Today, we want to discuss about the thinking. In COVID pandemic, we react quickly. We react emotionally, angry, anxiety, and etc., and we react ideologically. And to the extent that are possible, we also react by taking certain actions. You buy up goods from supermarket or panic flight from certain cities to other places. One thing we feel difficult to do, but what is very essential is thinking. Think analytically. What part of this very exceptional incidents is truly exceptional, or rather are they a reflection of some larger, very well established structural conditions? And what aspect of the pandemic will go away quickly, and what may have long-term impacts of our social and economic life? So how to think in the condition of emergency, and in a way how to make use of the emergency as a way to review something that have been hidden from our sight. And therefore we can think more critically and more clearly. In my mind, no one is better than Professor Ranabir Samaddar in Calcutta to teach us about thinking in emergency. Ranabir edited a book last year called Borders of an of not epidemic yet, epidemic, Borders of an Epidemic in 2020. I was astonished when I read the book. I mean, not only because by the fact it was produced so quickly, I was astonished by the quality. Very detailed documentation about what happened in rural India after migrants going back. I mean, we read a lot of the newspaper already. It's no shortage of information, but the shortage of systematic documentation. And furthermore, deep analysis, analytical analysis to make sense what it means and why it has happened and why it matters. And then to my surprise again, Ranabir wrote a book, a monograph this year, called a Pandemic and the Politics of Life, 2021. And that is a more theoretical book. Again, I was very impressed and surprised to see, a thinker can act and think so fast and cast a sharp light to what's going on now. So I think this is something we should all learn. And so I'm very pleased that Ranabir agreed to participate in this conversation. So Ranabir, thank you and welcome to our conversation. I would like to start by asking you about, along the line of thinking in epicenter, because now India is the epicenter in the world in this. I mean, no matter how, India is the second wave, but globally it's probably fourth wave of infection. I would like to ask you, Ranabir, about your analysis of what we call mobility event. Globally, but particularly in India, we observe one phenomenon that is, this religious festivals and political rallies and elections possibly played a role in the infection of virus. I mean, to what extent, of course, that is we as social scientists, we can't really determine. But what I found interesting is that why in contemporary society, and particularly India, events like that, involving large number of people coming from different parts of the country, and then they gather together, they mingle, and why it is so important. I mean, of course, we know traditionally it is always important, but now it seems that we are almost hijacked by such a big event to the extent that the political parties cannot afford to cancel. And in order to have this kind of large mobility event to carry on, they have to hide certain information or even lie, create all kinds of unintended consequences. In a time of rationality, it is in a time that in Habermas terms, it's the life world is supposed to be colonized by system. And why this kind of almost festival-like events are so important? I mean, how is that related to any larger structural condition?
Yeah, should I give my, small bit, offer my small bit on the
Yes.
question? First of all, I want to uh, give my thanks to both of you for initiating this discussion, which I hope will continue and will not end with today's talk, our deliberations. And it's an important discussion from many aspects. As you said, that it raises, or it's an occasion to raise some of the larger questions. And I shall begin from that, what it means to think of a larger context when you are situated in an emergency. Reflecting on an emergency after the emergency is over, when you can say that was an emergency, I can understand. But is it the same thing when you are in it? You are in the belly of the beast, and then what does it mean when you say that you want to think in that time? Because emergency would require of you quick responses, unanticipated things to which you must respond, and you do not have the scope, avenue, or the luxury to think strategically. Yet you know that it is through thinking the emergency that you will actually strike out a new path. So therefore, it's a paradoxical situation of being in the belly of the beast and thinking of the larger time and the larger questions. So this is something that I want to, uh, place. It has certain other, ramifications in terms of theoretical understanding, but I think we can leave that for a probably a quieter and a more philosophical time. But this is the survival time. Also, I'm very thankful for referring to the book, because the book, A Pandemic and the Politics of Life, was based on the report that you mentioned, but it was updated. It was the first two chapters, which the first chapter was on borders of an epidemic, and the second chapter, migrant as the figure of the epidemic. And then on the basis of these two, I theorize what I call biopolitics from below. And all these are summarized in terms of the 10 principles of what I think to be the politics of life. So that is important. Now, with these prefatory remarks, I want to come to your point. You had 2-3 questions, but the one that I remember as I was listening to you is that how do we, or how do I situate, let us say, the return of the epidemic, the pandemic, so people call it as the second wave, etc., etc., and uh, in the wake of the large congregations, the religious congregations, political meetings, and etc. Now, as I wrote in that book also, and I explained that what we think to be an epidemiological crisis is actually a conjuncture of several crises. So an emergency event in that sense is never uh, articulated on a single platform, on a single template. In fact, it's a platform where you have several crises meeting and producing the big moment of emergency. So last year, as I argued in that book, that the arrival of the virus, the question of a neoliberal economy and its, and changing our economy along neoliberal lines, a political crisis in terms of the legitimacy of governance in the wake of the massive protests in India uh, against the citizenship acts, etc., with many other things. So they all combined to produce the COVID crisis. So the COVID crisis is never purely an epidemiological crisis, as a famine is never purely a case of food shortage, but it is something much more, much, much more. And I think I didn't, and I'm not happy that if I prove to be, right, but it has happened again, that what you see now is a combination of several things. Uh, the fact that the government allowed such a massive religious congregation to take place, and I do not think that there was any compulsion to hold it. I don't think that people would not have understood, because after all, last year, the government, the state governments, they had stopped all religious congregations. And even though there were a little bit of, violation of government, but by and large, people understood. And by and large, they abstained from that. And the infection rate came down. And so now you have, first of all, why did the government allow? You can also say, what is it that leads a government to bank on, how would you put it, work advice and not depend on science? What is it that that makes a government think that its legitimacy is not at stake and that it can play with fire? Add to that the compulsion of holding the elections. And what is it that when political parties were saying, club the phases, don't hold it in that way, it could have been done little later, it could have been done little earlier. But again, the fact that the rulers never thought it in terms of emergency. The rulers thought it in terms of the daily stability of rule. Nothing will damage the rule. Nothing is going to, impact. The legitimacy is not at stake. So in the process, few may die, and I'm quite sure that the government didn't have any idea of the massive, impact of the return of the epidemic. It didn't do so deliberately, but it shows that it is quite confident and quite comfortable with, if you use the word, your stock of legitimacy. So you know that your bank of legitimacy is quite rich, and you can afford to take these risks. It's a different fact that it's in the elections, when the elections were taking place, the infection started rising absolutely vertically, and therefore, that the king was naked suddenly became, open to all. So I think what I am arguing, therefore, on this question is that the emergency is always a complex of certain factors, and probably the environmental crisis or a public health crisis as this one, massive, once in a century kind of that, is always a complex of many things. And this leads me to my the additional response. Why did the government allow? In order not to allow, and in order to chart out a path which will not only base itself on scientific evidence and scientific inputs, advice, but also to appreciate what are the deeper issues at stake, which I wanted to bring out in that book when I wrote that 2-page summary of the 10 principles of the politics of life, in order to understand that it is life at stake. And not only because there is a virus, but simply because the virus has accelerated many of the things that without the virus we would not have understood. In order to think along the line, what I suggest that you need a different kind of public power. And this is where, if you allow me 2-3 minutes more to make my case, you see, at a theoretical level, from, let us say, from Machiavelli's time or from in our own thinking, public power had constituted a different kind of thinking and a different kind of uh, uh, different kind of theme that had to occupy political minds, be they philosophers, minds of philosophers or statesmen or rulers or, writers, analysts, etc. And most of the time we were engrossed in thinking of the details of rules and regulations. So how is a parliament constituted? What is a representative system, etc., etc. But what is this nature of public, and why do we call it a public power, and why do we ask for a different kind of public power, is precisely the question that had vexed Machiavelli, that had vexed Marx, that had vexed Lenin, that had vexed many thinkers of our time. And the point that I want to raise is that, and if you do not mind my being blunt, is that by and large, it is not only Indian democracy, but Western democracy, liberal democracy as a whole, has suffered great legitimacy crisis because it failed its people in understanding what was the COVID crisis and how to think through the crisis and what to do in terms of defending the lives of the people. So not only what are the public health measures that are needed, not only how do you deal with the migrants, not only how do you erect the structure of care from below, not only how you reconceptualize the role of public institutions. In other words, which is both the public, the word public has both the element of state as well as the element of the general people. And at the same time, the COVID was showing that the COVID was not standardized. It was not uniform in its impact. And in coping with the COVID, segments of population were responding in a differential manner. That's how what happened. And that is why you need, along this horizontal, how would you put it, the horizontal participation and the horizontal assembly of different elements of society and different kinds of power, micro powers of different forms, with what you may call a kind of public power that is vertically present, that can guide society and impose compulsions. This is important because it is no power if it doesn't have the capacity to coerce, if it doesn't have the legitimacy to coerce. So a government that can say, sorry, this year the Kumbh Mela will not take place, which brought 1 million people. Sorry, we should have democracy elections, but not this way. It is not this kind of ritualized democracy at the expense of people's lives is a protocol that we are not bound to, So it is this kind of public power on which people would have trust. That power has to attain trust. So to your therefore main question, why is it? So my two answers: one is that it is a complex of causes, as it was in the last year, and second, that we do not have that power. And And it is not God-given that a second wave would be coming. It's not that in all countries the second wave had come. Why do we ignore the experiences of Southeast Asia, China, Far East, which have fared much, much better than Western Europe and United States and India? But we are so much West-centric that we always ignore the other kinds of things. So in terms of waves and all that, the idea of a wave is contingent upon many social and political factors. But we think as if wave is a very scientific natural phenomenon, as if it is working by kind of a Duex machine. It is God's own logic that is playing itself out. I'm sorry that I took a little more time.
No, that's a wonderful, Ranabir. It is a very enlightening analysis. I'm particularly struck by your point that the current supposedly democratic government is in a way hijacked by an agenda to maintain the stability of their legitimacy within the given structure. So therefore, they are not thinking of emergency, they are thinking of their own legitimate stability of ruling, and they are not thinking of out of box. I mean, they simply do not dare to, rather they have to think quite passively, within the given structure, how they can maximize legitimacy. Therefore, it just have to follow what is said as a routine, rather than can think creatively and persuade the public to do things differently.